Good afternoon and welcome to the 12th meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Today we will take evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the public finances, on the fiscal framework and on the summer budget revision. For the record, the committee has launched a call for views in its pre-budget scrutiny on the impact of COVID-19 on the Scottish Government's budget for 2021-22. So today's session will not be the end of the committee's interests in this area. We're joined for our first item agenda this afternoon, by Kate Forbes, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Scott Mackay, who is the Head of Finance Coordination, Dougie McLaren, the Deputy Director of Public Spending, and Daniel Heinz, who's the Deputy Director for Fiscal Responsibility. I welcome you all to the meeting, and I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would like to make a short opening statement.
I will. Thanks very much, Bruce, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on our public finances and also the impact that it exposes in terms of some of the limitations of the fiscal framework, which I know is a subject that the committee has looked at in depth. So the impact of the current crisis is, of course, huge for individuals and businesses, but also for government in trying to support both the direct health costs and also the various financial pressures across wider society, and we've done our best to react quickly. And I also want to pay credit to the UK government for the way in which they've worked collaboratively, and we have tried to coordinate the response in Scotland. But nonetheless, this financial impact does expose us to additional financial risks that the current fiscal framework arrangements don't allow us to effectively manage. And to offer an initial opportunity for Parliament to scrutinise the funding commitments that we have made in responding to the crisis, I have brought forward this additional summer budget revision to provide the transparency to Parliament over both the receipt and the allocation of the significant resources. So as normal, committee will have a copy of the brief guide to the summer budget revision prepared by officials, which I hope was useful. It's worth saying that this budget revision deals specifically with budget changes related to the COVID pandemic, and so it is by necessity a snapshot of the ongoing position, and any further changes to budgets to fund our response will be made at the autumn and in the spring budget revisions as normal, along with the other technical Whitehall and interportfolio transfers. So in summary, the net impact on all of those changes is an increase in the approved budget of £2,787.2 million to £52,037.9 million. Table 1.1 on page 4 of the supporting document shows the approved portfolio budgets following the changes sought, and the supporting document provides background. The gross increase in funding in the summer budget revision is £4 billion, just over £4 billion, which is then offset by a reduction of £972 million in non-domestic rates income arising as a result of a number of reliefs that were introduced by Scottish ministers, as well as savings from reprioritisation of £255.2 million to give that net increase of £2.7 billion. I want to be clear with the committee that the risks I'm having to manage on that funding position are quite significant. Of the £3.5 billion in Barnett consequentials allocated to the Scottish Government shown in the document, only £3 billion have currently been formally added to our block grant at the main estimate, and so the balance of those funds would be expected to be added to our budget at the UK supplementary estimate. But Treasury have made very clear, repeatedly so, that they're exploring with UK departments the capacity for them to meet additional COVID-related costs from within existing budgets, and that implies a risk that not all of the consequentials set out here will actually be provided. Indeed, funding position has already moved on, and we've seen Treasury rise down some of the consequentials that have been allocated in this revision. Specifically, £60 million for additional business support measures will be included in the budget revision, as well as £10 million for charities funding that have now been removed from the aggregate consequentials allocated year. So we're rightly expected to demonstrate that every penny of funding that is received is allocated to support the COVID response, and I've taken funding decisions in good faith where UK government announcements have clearly suggested additional funding and consequentials have been indicated. So the committee is already aware of some of the limitations within which I am required to manage the overall budget position. I've been clear that the restrictions within the fiscal framework are insufficient to manage the budget volatility that had already been explored by the committee and had been debated in the Parliament. So there's very limited room for manoeuvre within our budget, and that's why I'll continue to make the case to the UK government for stability in funding and for some additional flexibilities to allow us to respond more fully to the crisis. But on that, I'll stop and be very happy to take some questions.
Thank you for that opening statement, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure some of my colleagues will pick up on questions in regard to the summer budget revisions and the specifics of the consequentials you've already began to outline. But I could just start with a very general question. It's pretty clear now that there are differences in response across each of the four governments and four nations of the UK to the COVID crisis. I was wondering, to what extent is the differential approach sustainable from a fiscal perspective, particularly if the UK government continues to ease lockdown restrictions in England more quickly than in the rest of the nations of the United Kingdom?
Well, it's certainly something that we need to keep under review, because now I would suggest that the overall impact on our economy will, compared with the rest of the UK, will be minimal. It will be a question of degree rather than fundamental differences. There is, of course, a difference in speed in terms of unlocking, but the reason why that is the case is that in Scotland we want to see a stronger, more sustainable recovery in the long run. Today, the UK government published GDP impact stats, and there will be equivalent figures for Scotland published relatively soon. But clearly there is a different impact on different industries, different sectors. In Scotland, we are more exposed in some sectors, particularly tourism, and the rest of the UK will have its own share of impacts as well. And we're seeing that increasingly coming through some of the reports, not least the KPMG report earlier this week. But I think this goes to the heart of the question, because I was very grateful when the UK government extended the furlough scheme, because it allowed for a different pace in unlocking. But we know that the furlough scheme means that the unemployment figures are lower than they might have been without the furlough scheme. So it's been very welcome. The problem is that some businesses are already looking to October, are concerned that if they're not fully trading, both sides of the border by that point, or their customers haven't returned, or consumer demand isn't as strong as it was, then they will have to let people go, and we'll start to see the unemployment figures rising. And that's why we believe we need to have the powers, the flexibilities in order to adapt our budget to meet the needs as they arise over the coming months and years, if there is a disproportionate impact on Scotland.
That was actually sequences in quite nicely to my next question, actually, Cabinet Secretary, because the committee received some evidence regarding the need to make temporary adjustments to the fiscal framework in each of the devolved governments, given it the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID crisis. So what discussions have you and your colleagues in each of the devolved governments had with the HM Treasury on making such temporary adjustments to the framework? And more generally, what discussions have you had with your counterparts in Belfast and Cardiff regarding a joint approach to discussions with Her Majesty's Treasury in seeking to agree temporary adjustments to fiscal rules to deal with the crisis that we're currently facing?
Yes, the fiscal framework clearly wasn't designed for a pandemic or an economic crisis on this scale. And as it was, there was already a review baked into the fiscal framework suggesting that there would be need for improvements at a later date. And that this crisis just reinforces that. And I would argue that its restrictions actually jeopardise spending decisions. So we have had quite constructive conversations with the Treasury, and in a series of quadrilateral calls, my counterparts in Northern Ireland and in Wales have both reinforced the point that the levels of volatility and uncertainty in the fiscal framework are unmanageable without a move on some of the powers or the flexibilities that we've been asking for. So my hope is that the next quadrilateral, officials are currently working in partnership with Treasury officials, looking at what some of those flexibilities and powers might be to allow all of the devolved governments to manage the uncertainty. So I think there's an appetite there to look at what those flexibilities and powers might be, because the level of volatility and uncertainty is at such scale. And some of those are relatively basic things, as simple as being able to switch capital to revenue, all the way through to how we manage reconciliations over a longer period of time. So those conversations are ongoing. My point, though, is that this is having real life implications. So we need to get beyond the discussions as soon as possible and get into the substance of what flexibilities and powers I will have to manage the budget, free up resource, and continue to invest in our economy, in our communities, and in the public services that matter to people.
And finally, can I just probe a wee bit further? It's on the issue of moving expenditure from capital to resources. It's my understanding that the Welsh Government, for instance, have requested of HM Treasury that they relax the rule which prevents governments from moving expenditure from capital to resource. Have you made a similar case to the Treasury, and what response have you had, before I turn next to Donald Cameron?
Absolutely, they've made that case. We've made the case. Following the last quadrilateral call, I wrote to the Treasury highlighting the need for certainty and consequentials, for extra flexibility in relation to capital to resource switches. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. This year, we will probably have seen a whole quarter of construction work suspended. So that frees up some capital. And yet, on the other hand, we're facing the most challenging pressures on our revenue budget. So in order to deal with that, it would make sense to use some of that capital to help us with the pressures on revenue. If you take business support just now, businesses don't need capital just now, they need revenue in the form of grants. We've already exceeded the consequentials we got for supporting business. But if I could use some of that capital, then I could make that support go much further. And the same applies right across the board. So these are not huge new powers. These are not extensive flexibilities. These are some of the most basic powers that every government around the world has access to in responding to this crisis. And yet we don't. And it wouldn't undermine Treasury's position to give us some of that freedom and that flexibility to better manage our budget over this coming year.
Donald Cameron. Thank you, Cabinet.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I've got two questions for you, one general and one specific. My first general question is rather like the Convener, to ask you about the general impact of the virus on the economy and public finances. You made comments yesterday on the BBC when you suggested that the slump in Scotland could be worse than in England, and I think by implication that recovery could be slower due to the different pace of the easing of lockdown restrictions. And we've had evidence, I think, from the Fraser-Vallender Institute that have spoken about a disproportionate impact on the Scottish economy. Would you accept then that as a direct result of political choices by the Scottish Government in terms of easing lockdown, Scotland's economy could suffer compared with the rest of the UK, with severe consequences for our workers, our businesses, and the livelihoods of many people?
Well, can I respond by saying that saving lives is not a political choice, that ensuring we reduce transmission of the virus is not a political choice, that making sure that our economy bounces back in a more sustainable way is not a political choice. Those are the responsibilities and the duties facing all elected leaders in this country. And our challenge is to weigh up, looking at the enormous sacrifices that have been made by businesses, by individuals, by families over the course of the last few months. We need to make sure that our progress in managing the virus and enabling our economy to get back up and running is done with the confidence and the backing and the support of people in this country. So there's no value in me glibly trying to get the economy firing on all cylinders if consumer confidence is not where it needs to be, if the confidence of employees going back to work is not where it needs to be. But I do think that in taking this cautious approach, we will see the economy coming back in a more confident and a more sustainable way. But the point that Donald Cameron quite rightly picks up on is that if, because of our duty to protect people in this country, there are different impacts on Scottish industries or sectors of the Scottish economy, then it stands to reason that we should have the powers and the flexibilities to manage that. I've already said that I was very grateful, having raised the issue with Treasury a number of times, that the furlough scheme be extended so that there wasn't a cliff edge and we would be able to extend lockdown. It's grateful that that was extended, but businesses right now are looking at a cliff edge in autumn, and tourism businesses are seeing that even if they're given a date, even if they're given the certainty of reopening, it may not mean that the markets return. So they will not be able to contribute to the furlough scheme, and they will not be able to keep staff on once the furlough scheme finishes if that furlough scheme is not extended further, or at least adapted to certain sectors.
Thank you for that. Can I move on to my second question, which your answer sort of helps with, which is about borrowing and reserves. I'm glad to hear that you are having constructive conversations with the UK government. You have, however, reiterated both this week and just now your call for further borrowing powers. We know that even before the virus, there were very significant income tax reconciliations to manage in the next few years, and capacity to manage these is already limited. Spice advises that you are planning to make use of £66 million of reserves, leaving a total of £165 million in the Scotland Reserve, not to mention other planned borrowing in this year's budget. Given that you have used up much of the government's borrowing capacity even before the pandemic struck, can you understand the deep scepticism in some quarters that further borrowing is not the answer?
Well, perhaps I would suggest that the member lets the UK government know that, because we are seeing the UK government fund the vast majority of its response in terms of business support, in terms of the health, through borrowing. So we know that the OBR are suggesting that borrowing could increase to just over £300 billion this year, which is a £253 billion increase compared to its March forecast. And the question for me is why some of the opposition expect the people of Scotland to pay the price, whether that's through austerity and reprioritisation, or because we don't have the powers in place, rather than asking for additional funding at source. Now, our resource borrowing powers are welcome, but there are a number of specific and fundamental issues with those powers in the fiscal framework. So, for example, we are allowed to borrow £500 million for cash management, which we don't need, but not for budget cover, which we do need. In other words, we have the right power for the wrong fiscal risk. And the resource borrowing limits are not internally consistent. So we will not use borrowing, given that we will not use borrowing for cash management, it's almost impossible for resource borrowing to exceed 1.1 billion because of the annual restrictions, even though our cumulative limit is 1.75 billion. So the point I would make is that the reason I'm calling for borrowing powers, when of course rates are at a record low, is in order to respond to the exceptional circumstances in which we find ourselves, in line with the response made by every government around the world. And if we cannot see the borrowing limits extended, then at least give us the right powers for the right reason in order to manage the uncertainty. All of this is about how we respond to the needs that we see on the ground. The businesses that are in need, the communities that are in need, our health service, which requires additional investment. It's that simple. But at the moment, with a fixed budget, the only way that I can create additional headroom to meet those needs is by taking it from elsewhere. And I cannot, in good faith, take funding from the health service, from local government, or from the other frontline services that are helping us to respond to COVID.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We now move to Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to pick up on the sort of last few questions and ask the Cabinet Secretary to unpack a bit more what types of flexibility she would like to see added to the fiscal framework. She has spoken about the ability to transfer capital to resource and potentially borrowing over a longer period. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can unpack this a bit more and give the committee a flavour of some of the proposals she would be seeking to bring forward towards Treasury.
Thanks for that question. And the member will know, I mean, I think if we had full fiscal autonomy, we'd be able to respond fully to some of the needs. But that's not what I'm asking for here. What I'm asking for is some pretty basic powers and flexibilities. I've outlined some of them already there around the borrowing issues. So, you know, the narrow definition, the limits, and the reasons why we can borrow are not suited to a pandemic like this. But some of the other options that we are asking for is firstly guaranteeing a baseline level of consequentials. So at the moment, the consequentials that are allocated to our budget are all estimates. And to an extent, that's understandable because when the UK government is budgeting itself, it budgets on the basis of anticipated spend rather than, of course, actual spend. So those consequentials are estimates, but that means I'm always running the risk of seeing the figures revised down, sometimes as late as the last month of the year. That's what happened last year, which means I've got to create an element of headroom, because if I commit, for example, the 155 million to local government, which I have done, before it's actually allocated to our block grant, then I cannot take that money back. I have allocated it, and in good faith, I will honour that commitment. But it may mean that in the last month of the year, I've got to find funding from elsewhere. The other ones are, as I said, capital to resource, flexibility to carry forward greater levels of capital underspend than current limits allow, increased flexibility over borrowing, whether that's the scope, the limit, or the tenor of borrowing, cancelling any negative in-year block grant adjustment reconciliation, so deferring the impact until the final reconciliation, and also trying to allow for social security and tax reconciliations to be spread over a longer time frame, because the member will know our resource borrowing powers, which are limited to £300 million per annum, will not cover forecast tax reconciliations next year, which is their primary purpose.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to pick up on that last point, because the issue of insufficient borrowing powers to meet reconciliations, that concern predates the current COVID crisis. What I want to get an understanding of is your view on, if the Scottish Government is to take on more borrowing powers, would that mean that there would have to be a commensurate increase in revenue-raising powers over taxation? Because currently we're heavily dependent upon income tax, but if we are to take on more debt and to manage that in a responsible way, would that necessitate a sort of larger basket of taxes in order to manage that debt?
Certainly, if we're taking on more borrowing, none of our powers can be seen in isolation. So no tax power can be seen in isolation of our borrowing powers or our wider tax powers either. And so I do think that there's an argument to be made about how the fiscal framework in its totality is able to support the spending decisions that we make in Scotland in order to serve people. So, at the moment, I am very much making a plea that in these extraordinary circumstances, we need a review of the fiscal framework now. I need tangible and meaningful powers and flexibilities now. But clearly, that is just the tip of the iceberg of the wider debate.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My final question is to ask you, what would be the practical economic consequences were the Treasury not to heed your request for greater flexibility?
I mean, the risks are substantial because we have in this budget revision indicated the cost of coronavirus to date, and which is 4 billion. But of course, that's just a snapshot, and that figure is changing on a daily basis. The consequentials received to date are very gratefully received. I'm very, very grateful for the funding that the UK government has allocated. But it's not a political point to see that the costs are higher than the consequentials received. And so the choice is that either the UK government meets that shortfall or at least guarantees the funding to date, or if they can't do that, then give us the powers to manage it. But because this is a fixed budget, because by law I cannot overspend, if this year requires extraordinary spending in order to save lives and save the economy, then I will be hamstrung, or at least I'll be doing it with one hand tied behind my back, because whilst the UK government is able to borrow more to meet the needs, we cannot. And therefore, if there is a pressing need in one part of the budget, it will need to be taken from elsewhere. But because it's revenue that's under pressure, revenue is what pays our staff in the healthcare system. It's what keeps our local government going. Revenue is where the pressures are just now. But it would lead to austerity if I start moving revenue around because of the restrictions in our budget.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Jackie Baillie, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and welcome to the Cabinet Secretary. I want to explore some of the same territory we've already covered, because I think the fall in GDP of 20.4% is truly staggering, and it's clear we're going to face an economic tsunami with very devastating consequences for jobs in Scotland and indeed across the UK. So I'm wondering kind of what assessment, what modelling has the Cabinet Secretary done on the implications for the block grant if there was a fall in income tax in Scotland that was greater than the rest of the UK? Because, let me reference her comments again. She admitted that things in Scotland could be worse for longer than in England, and the economic impact could be very disproportionate. So on that basis, what is her modelling telling her?
So I'll give an initial answer, and then if officials want to come in, then they can. So obviously in terms of the modelling, it's the independent SFC that are responsible for forecasting our devolved tax revenues. Their most recent forecast was published alongside the budget, and no forecasts have been published since. I think you'll know that the SFC's recently highlighted the considerable uncertainty about the economic and the fiscal impact. And as the full scale, the full nature and the full duration of the economic downturn is still unclear, I think it would be reluctant to give figures just now on the impact on income tax and on other devolved and local tax revenues, because it does remain uncertain. I would include LBTT in that as well. But we are working very closely with HMRC and Revenue Scotland and local government to try and analyse the impact on tax revenue. Bear in mind, of course, that income tax revenue for 2021 are effectively locked in, and therefore any effects from the pandemic on income tax revenues in that year will not affect our budget until 2023-24. I don't know if any officials want to come in on anything else around income tax and the impact.
Right, okay, I'll just have to give you a couple of seconds. Any particular official you'd like to suggest, Cabinet Secretary, Help Broadcasting, or just... Sorry,
any of the above.
Okay, nobody's indicating at this stage on the bar, so I'm going to move on to the second question from Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm sure your officials will pay attention in future when you invite them to come in. You talked about the forecasting process, and I appreciate that there is lots of uncertainty still. But the reality is, in order to know what powers to negotiate, what flexibilities to negotiate, you should really have an order of magnitude of what's going on. And far be it for me to point out to the Cabinet Secretary that it is the case that the Scottish Government already owes £1 billion for income tax reconciliations, half of which, £555 million, needs to be paid back in the next financial year. So this is urgent, particularly as things are likely to get much worse. So I wish her well in the negotiations, but how we prevent cuts to public services has to be a top priority. Convener, can I ask the question about full fiscal autonomy? Because this was something that the Cabinet Secretary raised. And I am really curious to know how she thinks full fiscal autonomy would have helped us in the current COVID-19 crisis, given that she would have had to find an £8 billion budget gap, never mind almost £4 billion to spend on measures to tackle COVID-19. So I'm really curious, is it about spending cuts? Is it about increasing taxes? Because our growth has been so pitiful that actually you're not going to achieve it that way. And I would have thought she would have known that, being on the SNP's Growth Commission.
I find it remarkable when members ask questions about full fiscal autonomy as though every other country in the world responding to COVID does not also have full fiscal autonomy. And if you look at the response, the consistent response to coronavirus, which clearly exceeds available resources in most of those countries, is through borrowing. I already cited the UK government borrowing figures and the illustrative scenario from the OBR. But I mean, if the OBR's illustrative scenario and its forecast of increased borrowing is accurate, that takes the UK government's fiscal deficit to 15.7% of GDP, its highest level since the Second World War, and well above the level that we saw at the height of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So my argument just now is very much about having what I would call relatively minor powers and flexibilities to help us manage the volatility and the uncertainty just now. My job, my top priority, first thing on my agenda, is to ensure that we have the financial resources to continue to respond to the need as we see it. This is not a normal budget process, not me pontificating on what I think we might need. This is the very real reality for countless businesses, for countless families, and for countless individuals who are facing an uncertain future and need government intervention at a scale hitherto unseen.
Jackie, was that your final question, or was there something else?
One tiny one, but I'm testing the convener's patience, is a very quick question on the housing budget line, which is in the summer revisions. There's 105 million of capital being redeployed to support COVID-19 measures, What was the money originally to be used for? So what will we be missing because that money has been transferred?
You may need sorry, I was going to say you might need an official, so you might want to say who it is if you need one, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll try and answer it, and if they want to come in and correct me, they can. So it's 105, you said. So that was related to financial transactions. This is under the Communities and Local Government line, 105 million. And it was FTs that were allocated to Better Homes and was intended to be used to fund domestic energy efficiency loans in 2020-21. So the reprioritisation, the total 255 million, is nearly, well, it is all reprioritisation as a direct result of COVID. So it relates to areas which have experienced reduced demand over the lockdown period, and all of those funds have been redeployed to service providers to improve the support through the COVID response. So that's been redeployed as an emergency loan fund to support SME house builders that are facing liquidity issues due to the temporary closure of house building sites, and it's open to applications from house builders that are operating within Scotland, and it complements some of our other support schemes. But again, happy if any officials want to come in.
I'm not seeing a typed R from any official at this stage, although I see Scott looks as he may want to come in despite the fact he's not put an R in. Scott, am I right?
Oh.
Scott,
yes, you are. Yes. I mean, I was just echoing the point really that the Cabinet Secretary's made in terms of this is about redeploying largely demand-led areas where that demand has fallen as a result of the impact of the crisis, and then diverting that into areas to support the range of COVID responses. So it's the focus is in the reprioritisation has been on where there has been a fall in demand really as a result of the lockdown measures that have been put in place.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey. Patrick.
Thank you, convener, and good afternoon to our witnesses. I wanted to start with something the Cabinet Secretary began with in her opening remarks. She said she wanted to pay credit to the UK government for working in a collaborative way, and that there'd been good kind of constructive dialogue. And I wonder how that fits with some of the things the Cabinet Secretary has said elsewhere fairly recently. On the 28th of May, for example, she said, we discovered this week that 70 million had been promised by the UK and was withdrawn. We'd already passed that funding on to businesses and charities, but now we won't receive it. That kind of uncertainty of funding promised and then withdrawn makes it very difficult to budget. And the next day she was continuing to make statements about the funding gap, about estimates going up and down, and that the UK was creating huge uncertainty. That was the phrase the Cabinet Secretary used. Huge uncertainty created by the UK government. These two things can't both be true, that there is huge uncertainty being created by the UK government, funding promised and then withdrawn, and at the same time that there's been good constructive engagement, collaborative working between the two governments.
Thanks, it's a very fair question, and I suppose I'm trying to frame my points here not as a means of being irritated or frustrated with the UK government, but actually trying to make meaningful progress at working with them. Now, the value of that will be seen in the coming weeks when they either deliver on those additional flexibilities we've been discussing or they don't. But some of the frustration I have is actually with the very structures of the fiscal framework and indeed the devolution settlement in terms of how it can respond to a crisis like this. Because already the challenge of responding is such that I think we need more powers. But when you start to appreciate that the very consequentials that have been given can be revised down, and the example given was the £60 million for business consequentials and the £10 million for charities. It illustrates the scale of the problem. And these figures, these consequential figures, are estimates. And if that can be done to the 60 million, then it may well be done to some of the other funding we've received. It also illustrates some of the challenges we have, because when announcements are made, great fanfare, opposition politicians quite rightly demand that we pass on that funding as quickly as possible. That could be to local government, it could be for business support. Perhaps not fully appreciating that there's a difference between an announcement that's been made and that funding actually being passed on to our block grant. It means then that we, in good faith, pass on the money only to find it potentially withdrawn later on. So I would say that I am trying very hard to work constructively with the UK government, and certainly there's been more engagement than ever before, but I'm doing it with a purpose, and that purpose is to put our public finances on a more stable, certain footing. And I hope that that constructive response to the UK government will pay off. But the truth of that will be seen in the coming weeks.
Thank you. I'm not trying to deny that these situations are going to cause complexity and difficulty. And even though we probably both agree with something in the area of more powers up to and including the point of independence, that's not the point I'm making either. I'm just looking to understand at a factual level how collaborative actually is the relationship. Is the UK government working in advance with the Scottish government and the other devolved administrations to develop its financial response, and is it giving you information in advance about the policies that are in development, or is it just landing stuff on you?
It's gone through phases. I think that it's gone through phases of being very helpful and constructive, where we've got a sense of what's coming down the track, and then there are many times where we're caught off guard as well. We have had far more conversations in person, on the phone, than we might have done, and the most recent quadrilateral meeting was on the 19th of May. Now, a follow-up to that meeting has been postponed a number of times, but I'm hopeful that there will be another conversation in the coming weeks. Now, at the 19th of May conversation, I think we saw significant improvement, going from an unwillingness to look at additional flexibilities to actually a proactive position from Treasury, volunteering some ideas around managing those flexibilities. And my hope is at the next Quad meeting, we will have tangible proposals that we can forward. So I would say that I still have a number of frustrations. I would like to know some of these announcements in advance so that we don't, so that we can work in tandem. That isn't always the case. I would like guaranteed consequentials. That isn't the case. I would like more flexibilities. There's an opportunity in the next week for that to be delivered. If it's not, then my answer will probably be very different going forward.
Okay, thank you. Moving away from the intergovernmental relationship, I'm just looking at the state of the Scottish budget then, assuming we pass the budget revision in front of us at the moment. The Cabinet Secretary has been quite clear that in some areas of demand-led spending, there's been a reduction of work that's not happening. You mentioned energy efficiency, for example, and I think we would understand in the current circumstance, not all spending is happening as planned. But I think you've also said in the chamber, you've been quite clear that you won't yet be able, until sometime later in the year, to absolutely pin down all of the areas where there's been slippage. For example, on capital projects that are not proceeding according to the original schedule. When do you expect to be able to identify further slippage? What are the areas where that may happen, or where you're aware that you don't yet have all the information? And is it possible to get anywhere close to a ballpark estimate of the scale of the further slippage that we'll expect to see within the Scottish budget?
I mean, any changes that have not been included in the summer budget revision will of course be included in the autumn budget revision. So I suppose that's the next formal point at which Parliament can scrutinise the changes in our budget. As you'll appreciate, when it comes to capital, a lot of those figures are changing on an ongoing basis. We know that, of the live projects in our pipeline for this period, the vast majority have been affected in some way. The issue is how much capital that may make available, because it may well be that some of those projects can make up lost time before the end of the year. My work just now is trying to identify those figures and then try and redeploy it back into the economy so that we continue to invest in the economy. And clearly, investing capital will have a positive impact on economic growth at a very challenging time.
Thank you for that. One very short last question at this time, Convener. I'm hoping that they'll get a very short answer in the form of yes. That the autumn budget revision is likely to be a place where much bigger political choices are at stake than the summer budget revision we're looking at the moment. So can the Cabinet Secretary give us a commitment that there will be a more open and reflective, consultative approach to developing the autumn budget revision, allowing not just Parliament but civil society and other interested parties to feed into the Scottish Government's decision-making process? The normal budget revision process doesn't really have that, but the political choices in the autumn one are likely to be as significant as a budget.
So it's a yes, but the autumn revision is, as you'll know, it's retrospective, it's looking back, it's accounting for changes that have normally already been made. The opportunity for engagement must come before that. I know we've got a debate in the Parliament, I think it's next week or in the coming weeks certainly, to discuss anticipated or expected or suggested ideas for our budget, and I will continue to listen very carefully to people's ideas, and obviously in the last week have engaged with representatives from every party on both the budget, finance and the economy, and I'll continue to do that.
Thank you. George Adam, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I would like to ask a question with regards to local government funding. Now, we've obviously all seen and heard about the £155 million consequentials to local government, and I appreciate the challenges that you have with the way things have been. But, you know, I used to be a councillor a long time ago, Cabinet Secretary, an administration councillor, and after the 2008 crash, we had some serious challenges with the budget from then on in to deal with. Now, with COVID-19 situation that we are in now, surely that's going to be even larger, even bigger challenges to local authorities. And if, as you've said, you're looking for additional flexibility from Westminster to be able to deal with the budget and create some stability. So should we not, Cabinet Secretary, look at some form of windfall tax for some of the firms that have done well during this crisis? Firms like online firms like Amazon, Google, some of the big box retailers even. Should we not be looking at some form of windfall tax to try and create that stability that you're looking for?
Yeah, I'll answer the tax and then local government. So I agree. You know, in the past, we have been very supportive and sympathetic to, for example, a new digital tax. And in fact, I think the Chancellor suggested that he was going to introduce a digital tax in autumn 2018, if I remember correctly. So clearly, there are some very large organisations, corporations that have benefited significantly from the pandemic, and I think that we should be looking to them in order to fund some of our needs going forward. You know, I believe that all taxpayers should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. The vast majority of the UK tax system is reserved, but you know, it's absolutely right to ensure all avenues remain open when assessing how we respond to the severe economic effect. So I am very much open to that. the member will know that there is a mechanism under the Scotland Act which would allow the UK Parliament to devolve powers for a new national tax in Scotland with the agreement of the Parliament. So we will keep all of that under review. It was going to be progressed as part of the non-domestic rates legislation until the Chancellor indicated that he was going to do something, and we decided to see what that would be. So I certainly think it's time for that to be delivered. I can respond to local government now, unless there's another question more specifically on local government.
Well, I'm quite happy to actually, my next question was actually, my final question was going to be on the idea of local government when you're talking about the stability, and not so that we don't end up in the same kind of sushi with local government that we have in the past. Would it not be a case that having these powers and this type of tax would be able to give you the opportunity to reinvest in local government, who in turn could reinvest in local businesses in our communities, and be able to kind of help ourselves get out the other end of this very difficult time that we're going to have in the future?
Yeah, I mean, for all the headlines that might suggest otherwise, I actually have a really good working relationship with COSLA's finance spokesperson in looking at how we support COSLA. And I think there's a growing understanding that when it comes to the constraints of our budget, if there is going to be significantly more investment in local government, it needs to come from the source, which is the UK government. And I know that COSLA have talked about making, or have made an approach to the UK government in collaboration with English local authorities to ask for more funding. But we have, as far as we can, tried to help local government, both with their cash flow issues as well as with their budget. We've already talked about the £155 million that was passed on, and that takes the overall investment in local government to just over 300 million, which is clearly more than the consequentials we received. But that's because local government are on the front line. Local government staff have done an enormous amount of work in the last few weeks, many working day and night to get grants out, for example, or to support families in need, or to help with questions around council tax payments. So, we are front loading all of our grant payments so that there isn't an issue with cash flow. We agreed with COSLA that if there were any cash flow problems being reported by local authorities, we'd make further adjustments to the payment profile. But as at the 4th of June, Scottish local authorities have received grant payments of over £2 billion, which is an increase of just over 200 million more than was originally planned. And by the end of July, they will have been paid £3.8 billion, which represents an increase of £450 million more than originally planned to help them with cash flow.
Okay, thank you very much. Murdo Fraser, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I'd just like to get some clarity around the figures that have been spent on COVID-related issues, including business support. Going by the information provided by SPICE to us, the allocation of funding as at May 15th was just over 4 billion against UK Barnett consequentials at that time of 3.581 million. So the balance of that was 433 million, made up of 255 million from a reprioritisation of existing Scottish Government expenditure, 112 million of unallocated non-COVID related consequentials from the UK budget in March, and 66 million from central funds in the Scotland Reserve. Now, SPICE have also told us that subsequent to 15th May, there's been a further 139 million in Barnett consequentials coming to the Scottish budget, which, according to my arithmetic, means that it's found from its own resources to spend on COVID issues is 294 million. I don't know if that figure is still accurate, or whether there's any update you can give the committee in terms of whether there's been any additional expenditure on top of that since the date of the regulations you're laying before us today.
So, correct me if this doesn't answer your question, but the summer budget revision is very much a snapshot in time. So if you take health, for example, we had received consequentials amounting to 620 million, which have been included in the budget revision. But since that revision went to press, there's been a further 158 million in additional funding for the health service. So most of the additional, in fact, officials can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of the additional consequentials since it went to press is to do with health and social care.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. So I think, as at 15th of May, according to this, we're looking at 433 million from your own resources, and subsequent to that, there may have been a bit more money. The reason I ask the question is because, as you know, there's a lot of pressure from businesses who are looking for more support. There are businesses who feel they've fallen through the gaps. There are businesses who, for example, those who have rateable values above £51,000, who've not had grant support and are looking for it. And whenever we ask these questions to the government, to you and your colleagues, you always say, well, we'd like to do more, but we're depending on the UK government to give us more resource. Now, we heard as a committee in evidence last week from the Institute for Fiscal Studies that the Welsh Government, as at April, the Welsh Government had found some 526 million from its own resources, in addition to Barnett consequentials, for COVID-related initiatives, including business support. Now, given that the Welsh Government's budget is probably, in general terms, half or slightly less than half Scottish budget, proportionally that's much more. In fact, that's more than double the amount of money that the Scottish Government are putting in. So I suppose my question is, why are the Welsh Government able to more urgently reallocate resources from within their budget to a much greater extent than the Scottish Government is so far able to do?
Well, we've obviously included reprioritisation in the budget revision, and in autumn those figures will be updated and may well be higher, not least because we have already developed new schemes, new initiatives, the only ones of their kind in Scotland to meet the business support need. So whether it's the Pivotal Resilience Fund, which it was, I think, when this went to press, was at £90 million, but has since increased by 30 million, or whether it's a hardship scheme, which again, when this went to press, was probably 20 million and has increased to 30 million. Much of our business support in terms of those packages will draw on funding from the Scottish Government, so are not part of the business consequentials. Some of the business consequentials are going to those packages, but clearly we've had to draw on our own budget in order to meet the additional costs of our much wider package of support.
But and as my final question, Convener, you've spoken a lot, Cabinet Secretary, today, and you've spoken about it in the last couple of weeks about the need for more flexibility, the need for more funding from the UK government. But it seems that devolved administrations in other parts of the UK are able to find substantially more resources from reallocating budgets than you've been able to do. So I suppose my question is, have you had any discussions with the Welsh Government as to how they are able to do this when you're not able to do it to the same extent?
My understanding with the Welsh Government's reprioritisation is that they reprioritise around £250 million. So, and they also reference potential repurposing of EU structural funds above that. So it would be worth drilling into those figures. But, I will have to look across the budget in order to meet the needs. We've included some of that here in £255 million. But the bottom line is the same as it was when we started this session, which is, the UK government is not funding its multi-billion pound interventions, critically important interventions, through reprioritisation, because it can't. It would require complete departments to be shut down to fund the level of spend, which is absurd. They don't do that. They borrow at record low interest rates to fund that response. So I don't see why we should expect the people of Scotland to suffer and see a return to austerity just because this government doesn't have the basic powers to respond.
Okay, John Mason, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and probably to build on some of the points that have already been raised. Cabinet Secretary, if I understood you correctly, you said that 3 billion had been added to the consequentials formally, but the figure, is that in comparison to about 3.72 billion, which has been indicated? So the kind of uncertain amount would be about 720 million, is that correct?
So that figure is moving every day, but in this revision, there is 3.58 billion in forecast foreign consequentials, and as part of an overall response of 4 billion. So the figure that we have, as it were, in the main estimate that has been added to our block grant is just above 3 billion.
Right, and is there any timescale for when this will kind of solidify and you'll be more clear as to what you're definitely getting?
Well, this would be worth officials coming in, because the process is usually that the block grant is confirmed, well, sometimes as late as the last few days of March in the previous financial year. So last year, certainly, it was a very late confirmation, and it was in March, I believe. So our plea at the moment to the UK government is not to leave it as late as March, actually confirm what consequentials will be coming. But we also know that the UK government is asking its departments to fund as much of the COVID response as possible from its own resources, which means that if the actual spend is lower than the allocated spend, then there might be some clawing back of consequentials. But I don't know if any official wants to come in to talk about the supplementary estimates and when that happens.
Cabinet Secretary Scott Mackay has indicated he would like to come in. So, Scott Mackay.
So the only formal revision process for the UK budget is in supplementary estimate, which is the very early part of the next calendar year. So we'll be engaging with Treasury on the formalities of the supplementary estimate as we get into January, and it was into February before that was really being finalised last year. A lot of the engagement that there has been today at official level at the moment is about trying to secure as much early insight on how the position is developing in terms of firming up the figures on consequentials and the outcome of the current exercise that Treasury is undergoing in terms of reviewing reprioritisation options within UK departments, so that we have more clarity on what is coming out of that UK exercise and how that might be impacting on the Scottish budget early enough to allow us to respond more fully, rather than having to wait until that supplementary estimate process in the early part of 2021.
Can I correct myself as well? Apparently last year the supplementary estimates were actually in February, not March.
Okay. Well, following on from that, do we know, has the Treasury given the UK departments any timescale as to when and if they can find savings within their own budgets? Because presumably that would help us if we knew what they were coming up with.
So again, I'll ask if officials have more information than I do on when that exercise is due to be complete in the UK government, but I don't as yet have an understanding of a date by which that needs to be completed from the UK government's perspective.
Okay, which official would like to choose this one? Scott, is it you again? Or is it Dougie? Dougie, yeah. On you go. Oh, no. Dougie, McLaren.
Thank you, convener. I mean, Treasury have indicated the exercise is ongoing, and I think due to conclude fairly soon, i.e. this month, and we should get an update from that at the next finance quad.
Okay. Any final question, John?
Is this the final one? Is it? I'll combine it. I was going to have two more. My assumption is that the cash is a completely separate question. So we've got the potential consequentials, we've got the definite consequentials, and then the cash, in a sense, is a less important decision. And so linked in with that, I was just going to ask about this is my final question then, the 155 million for local government, if we look at it from what Scotland is giving to the councils, Is that a vague commitment? Is it a definite commitment? Or does the cash not matter?
The cash matters. I don't fully fully understand the question, but the 155 million is confirmed to local government. I've confirmed that we will pass on that, and indeed it's being paid on a weekly basis throughout June. So the second instalment will have been made on the 10th of June. I think some of the commentary in the public domain was confusing cash management with budget. They've known it was coming for several weeks and could budget on that basis. We also were supporting their cash management process by front-loading all the grants so that they get the cash up front and they don't get it later down the line.
Okay. I'm sorry, I probably confused matters a bit there by that. Really, I think what you were asking is, has the 155 million, which has been passed on to local authorities, actually been received yet by the Scottish Government in terms of that resource transfer via the Barnett formula? I'm assuming that's what you're meaning, John. Apologies.
Right. No, it's not been received yet.
And to help John, is there an expectation of when that might happen?
No, but I would assume it won't happen until the supplementary estimates, which will be much later in the year, indeed possibly at the beginning of next year, unless we get that upfront agreement from Treasury to guarantee our consequentials earlier in the year than they would normally.
Okay, does that help you, John?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Convener and Cabinet Secretary. You've been making calls to have more borrowing powers. I just want to expand a bit on that, on exactly who you're planning on tapping up for this money. I mean, you mentioned the low interest rates earlier, and I know that Professor Gallagher said last week it would be silly to go anywhere else than the UK Treasury, given their capacity to borrow at low or even negative interest rates. I just wonder where your thoughts were on this, and what conversations you had either with Treasury or whether you're looking elsewhere.
No, I mean, that would be. I don't know if anybody wants to come in terms of, again, we're constrained in terms of our borrowing powers, but I'm less concerned about the source and more concerned about being able to use those powers. But there are pretty established processes for the Scottish Government borrowing, how we can borrow, where we can borrow, and for how long. I don't know if it would be helpful to have a more factual, technical answer on what the restrictions are to our borrowing and where we might borrow from an official.
Scott, I think probably you just stuck an R in, so Scott.
Yes, we are restricted in where we can borrow. Resource borrowing needs to be, under the current rules, needs to be from the NLF, the National Loans Fund. So that is obviously a way we can access funding at relatively low rates. And indeed, one of the flexibilities that we could pursue is being able to borrow more widely, although it would be difficult to access the rates. Certainly in the shorter term, that are available from the National Loans Fund.
Okay, Alexander.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Just following on those questions from John Mason, given the lack of flexibility that the Cabinet Secretary has already outlined, can she just crystallise what happens if the consequentials we expect are revised downwards, and we know there's a risk of that from the evidence that committee's heard? What choices then does the Cabinet Secretary have to balance her budget?
So the truth of the answer is that I have no alternatives when it comes to balancing a budget. By law, this budget must be balanced. At the moment, the response to COVID is more expensive than the consequentials we've received. I have two ways to meet that shortfall. Either it comes from elsewhere in the budget, or the UK government provides additional funding to meet that shortfall. Now, it's unlikely they're going to do that because they're also facing some challenges. So therefore, the only option, if I don't have flexibilities and powers, is that that money is reprioritised from elsewhere in the budget. But because it's revenue, we're talking about the front line of the NHS. We're talking about local government. We're talking about the public services that we absolutely rely on and that will be critical in taking us through austerity, taking us through the next few months. So I can't countenance a return to austerity when families and individuals and businesses are already struggling. I want to be able to continue to support them, but to do that, I need those flexibilities and powers. The UK government can borrow. They can meet that shortfall. The UK government can provide us with flexibilities and powers in order to manage the volatility. All of this is extremely technical until you realise the impact it has on individuals, on families, on businesses in this country. And it's right and understandable that members across the chamber ask for more to be spent in areas of our response to COVID. And I understand that. Going through recovery, we'll need that more than ever, particularly if the unemployment figures start to rise. I want us to be able to respond, to care for people, to protect people, to invest in businesses, to meet their cash flow gaps. But to do that, I either need Treasury to provide us with more funding or to give us the powers and the flexibilities to do it ourselves.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That's crystal clear that if we want to avoid cuts, we either need additional resources or more flexibility and more powers. Now, you spoke very eloquently about the Scottish Government's needing the right powers for the right reasons. And I wonder, does the same apply to local government? Do we need to review, for example, local government taxation?
So I think we do need to review local government, and that's been some of the conversations I've had, that what are the flexibilities that local government needs in order to be able to respond to COVID. So providing funding is one thing, but how else can we support local government? And we've already provided quite significant flexibilities when it comes to funding, such as around early learning and childcare. Local authorities can use that funding to meet other needs. But I'm very open to a conversation with local government about how else we can support them to get through the next few months and beyond. And if some of those powers reside with the Scottish Government, we'll look carefully at them. If some of them reside with the UK Government, particularly around some of the loan funding and the interest payments, then we can make a joint approach to the UK Government.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, Alec Rowley, please.
I think we've heard quite a bit this morning about, and Angela Constance just did there, about the right powers for the right reasons. But I do wonder, is the government, or I may have missed it, is the government intending to set out more detailed proposals? So, for example, bringing forward the review of the fiscal framework, how are you getting on with that? What is the case for doing that? The removal of the borrowing cap, something that Labour supports. We support the Parliament having far greater powers in these areas. But is the government intend to bring a policy paper forward that sets out, given the crisis we're currently in, what powers we actually do need and what changes, what flexibility we need? Is that the Cabinet Secretary's intention to do that?
Thanks. I'd be very happy to provide further information as Parliament or members would like around the proposals that we are making. Officials are currently engaged in discussions with Treasury on a variety of fiscal flexibilities which could help us manage the budget. But the options which seem to be gaining most traction just now in terms of meaningful powers right now are around flexibility between capital and resource, and also on resource borrowing. And Treasury officials are already discussing those with the devolved government. The first of those flexibilities could well be the most beneficial because it means there's no knock-on costs. We're using a budget that we found in capital in order to support revenue, but borrowing would also clearly provide additional flexibility depending on the detail of the powers granted. I've identified some of them, so I think there's a clear case to substitute the £500 million cash management borrowing for COVID borrowing. That would not require us to increase the total limit, only the annual limits and the restrictions. We could increase the term of resource borrowing to 8 to 10 years for this year, and that would be crucial to avoid placing undue pressure in subsequent years. And we could also look at an allowance to borrow against all tax reconciliations. So these are, as I said at the beginning, they're relatively minor flexibilities and powers. If we look beyond the immediate short term, there's certainly a case to be made, as Tom Arthur alluded to, for a much broader look at the package of financial powers we have, because ultimately they all have a knock-on impact on each other. And I would like to see the fiscal framework in totality being reviewed earlier than was envisaged, which is next year.
I think it would be useful to be able to set out those specifics and set out, why the government would want those flexibilities, those powers, being able to switch capital to revenue. I think that would be useful to build the case and to build the argument so that all politicians in Scotland are able to then start to put that case forward. Because I think many people are now saying, well, what is the plan? They don't think that furlough will last forever. There are some sectors of the economy it's difficult to see looking forward even into next year where some sections will open up. We do know that there's going to be major unemployment. So what is the plan is what people are asking. And on that question of plan, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that we now need to see a greater role for the state within the economy, much more moving towards a planned economy? I know, for example, Colin Wheel have produced a report with some very interesting ideas, but public procurement being one of them. The CBI, I heard speaking this morning on national television, talking about a programme to tackle fuel poverty and insulate houses across the country. So there is, my view is, and I asked the Cabinet Secretary, does she agree with this? There needs to be a greater intervention within the economy. We do need to actually be looking more at a planned economy, and there will have to be job creation schemes that will bring about social worth, that will bring about investment into the economy. Does she agree with that? And if she does, is the government intending to start bringing forward proposals in those areas?
Well, yes is the short answer, but we are already doing that. So the debate next week will provide an opportunity for Parliament to debate both fiscal flexibilities on one hand, but also the measures that we need to take to see our economy growing in a fair and a sustainable way. I mean, the last few months, I think, have turned political ideologies on its head. I mean, who would envisage that a Conservative government in Westminster would have intervened in the economy in such a welcome way, but to such an extent in terms of the furlough scheme or the self-employed income support scheme. So I think that level of government intervention will be required going forward, because this is not just a case of a short sort of dip in the economy. It's, I think, going to be clear that we won't bounce back as fast as we thought we might have, and there will be a much more gradual return to pre-crisis levels of activity and output. So clearly the governments in Scotland and the UK for now will continue to need to be heavily involved in the economy in order to get it back up to a level of trade. But there's also an opportunity to do things differently. And I know Fiona Hislop is certainly looking at this very carefully. We're looking forward to the report from the Economic Advisory Group on economic recovery as well, about not just how we can get the economy trading again, but how do we see change? How do we reposition our economy? How do we take advantage of some of the opportunities, whether that's through digital and technology, or whether that's seeing the oil and gas industry transition faster to green and renewable sources of energy. Those are all opportunities for our economy, but it will take some innovative thinking and some active intervention in order to see that happen.
And finally, Convener, I would say to you, sitting in Fife just now, Cabinet Secretary, talking about a green agenda, having yards lying empty in Burnt Island and Methil just up the road for here, the government will have to intervene much more if we're going to get the benefit of these green jobs. But is she finally also looking at other areas? George mentioned a windfall tax. We discussed that last week. Tax on land, etc. What is the government's thinking, looking at new ways of being able to generate income? And then if we need further powers to progress that, then that argument can be made. But are you looking at other areas, particularly around, I see that many of the wealthy landowners in Scotland have been gaining from some of the government grants that's available. Are we going to look at those wealthy landowners maybe paying a bit of tax on the land that they own across Scotland?
We will look at everything, but it's got to be with a purpose. And the purpose for the next few months, leading to the next few years, is to provide as much certainty as possible to businesses and to communities to invest in public services and to ensure that our economic growth is fair and sustainable. I think that the crisis has magnified some of the inherent structural inequalities in our society. It has seen, some forms of progress accelerate much faster than ever before. So again, looking at things like digital and technology, we have been forced into a position where SMEs around the country are adopting digital in a way that they never did before. But we're also going to see unemployment figures rise as well. And I think the furlough scheme has kept those figures lower than they might have been. But we will have to take a very active interventionist approach to support those who are being made redundant into new work, into new training, into new skills opportunities. So that level of intervention will continue. We will look at all suggestions, all proposals. Nothing is off the table, but it has to be with a purpose. And that purpose is to support families, to support communities, support business, and ultimately to make Scotland a fairer, but also a prosperous country.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. One final question from me, because over the course of the taking of evidence in the last few weeks, we've heard about the impact of COVID in particular sectors in Scotland and the differential impact between ourselves and the rest of the UK. For instance, in the oil sector and the tourism sector, we expect a bigger impact on the capacity in Scotland for income tax raising to emerge because of these impacts, balanced off perhaps because of a greater level of public sector involvement in Scotland, and particularly in regard to pay levels. But in regard to one particular sector I mentioned there, tourism, obviously it was very welcome news that the Cabinet Secretary gave us last week about the opening up potentially, if everything goes well, of the tourism sector from the 15th of July. But I think all of us who are engaged in discussions with the tourism industry know that even though that industry is opened up, it will be hugely difficult for these businesses to continue because of the physical distancing guidelines that we have. But I was wondering, could you provide any update on the discussions which I know the Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing has been having with the Treasury in regard to further help for the tourism industry in Scotland, because that's one sector that we know is going to be slower coming out of lockdown in Scotland, and therefore will need specific help and assistance to see themselves through this particular period?
That's right, yes, I can. Clearly, tourism will face a disproportionately harder hit, harder impact, and perhaps for longer, having missed obviously trading over the winter and now a very, very delayed summer season. And even with the certainty of a new date, it may be the case, it's highly likely to be the case, that there will continue to be challenges. So Fergus Ewing and I have written to the Chancellor to ask him to consider providing additional funding, a real significant injection of support to the tourism industry. Now that would include things like reviewing the VAT rates, which we can't control, extending the job retention scheme to that particular sector, and also any other business support which they will need. We've seen from countries like France that the investment being made in tourism is pretty eye-watering because it's such a critical industry to those countries. And that's the kind of thing we would like to see. We will do what we can, and even today in a completely different industry, but one that's also faced huge impact, the oil and gas industry. Fiona Hislop just announced before we started this committee briefing that there would be a £62 million energy transition fund to take businesses, to help businesses with the transition. So I think there's a case to be made for sector-specific forms of support. But when it comes to tourism, I think that needs to be complemented by things like a cut to VAT rates, as well as an injection of cash.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We now move to agenda item 2, which is consideration of the motion on the summer budget revision. I therefore invite the Cabinet Secretary to move S5M 21863 that the Finance and Constitution Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2020 Amendment Regulations 2020 draft be approved.
I move that motion in my name.
And I'll give it a couple of moments to see if members have got any comments in terms of the R appearing in the chat line. I'm not seeing anything. I therefore put the question. The question is that motion S5M 21863 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Any member who disagrees should type N in the chat bar. Again, I am seeing no disagreement, and therefore the motion is agreed to. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials for their evidence today. The committee will now publish a short report to Parliament in the coming days, setting out our decision on the summer budget review. As agreed last week, the clerks will also draft a letter for the Cabinet Secretary and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, highlighting some of the issues we consider in evidence over the past few weeks and regarding the impact of COVID-19. As this is the last item on our agenda, I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Thank you very much to everyone involved.